You're listening to China Manufacturing Decoded from the Sofeast Group.
Hi, so today I thought I would be something a little bit different because I've been reading a pretty interesting book and I wanted to focus on one aspect, is how basically the electronics industry in China really gets set up and get going on a large scale, and how it came to be world leading in many respects. So the book I've been reading is called Apple in China, and the subtitle is The Capture of the World's Greatest Company. All right, it's a little bit of exaggeration, but okay. So this has been written by a journalist called Patrick McGee, and he has been covering Apple for years. I think let me see. Here's his bio. They say he worked for the Financial Times, and he covered Apple for years. So he's been in contact with a number of Apple ex-employees and observers and people in the ecosystem and people working for the contract manufacturers and so on and so forth. All right. They say he led Apple coverage at the Financial Times from 2019 to 2023, based in San Francisco. Okay, originally from Calgary, Canada. And this book is making a lot of noise. I saw a bunch of mentions about it in the press, in the LinkedIn feed, and so on and so forth. And I thought, okay, let's have a look, And one of the things that he said is that, here I'm quoting from the publisher's notes, without explicitly intending to, Apple built an advanced electronics industry within China, only to discover that its massive investment in technology upgrades had inadvertently given Beijing a power that could be weaponized. Okay. First, I should say this is a book written by a North American journalist, in good part for a North American audience. Okay. However, the way it's written, so far I haven't finished the whole book, but it seems to be pretty well researched, and relatively balanced in the way it explains things. So, let's get into it. What is really interesting here is the explanation, basically the history of how Apple moved away from their model of doing manufacturing in-house, and then, let's say, get some experience, get its feet wet, and then really jumped in with just outsourcing manufacturing, and they ran into issues, and then they found that, hey, in China, the way it's set up, we can really have our own people in there and control every aspect of it, and totally lead the relationship. And this is really the best of both worlds. We have basically about as much control as when we had our own manufacturing facility, and maybe more, because we call the CEO and he's going to go down and he's going to push people to move so fast and so on. Maybe we have more. There's actually more speed, more flexibility. Okay, and it's lower price, and so on and so forth. So they really found it so convenient that now it's a bit hard to go somewhere else because there's no somewhere else with the same ecosystem. But let's look at the history, right? First, the book starts with, hey, Apple in the 1980s, it was making, its products in-house. It had a few manufacturing facilities in the US, also in some other places like Singapore. Okay. But mostly it was in California, Colorado, okay, in the US. And they had great difficulty industrializing some of their new products. It seems like at that point, their DFM, design for manufacturing capabilities, their NPI, new process introduction capabilities were rather weak. They got much better since then, but they're rather weak, and they had all kinds of problems that really are indicative of a, let's say, design and engineering driven company that is not very good at manufacturing. Okay. And that's actually quite typical in the electronics industry, where people spend a lot of time working on the engineering of their products and not so much about the engineering of their processes. Okay. So they really suffered long delays. This was quite common. Their first portable computer actually suffered long delays, and it was a commercial failure because the product was way too late on the market. So for the second model of portable computer, one of the managers advocated for outsourcing the manufacturing. That led to a lot of debates, but the history, the track record on the first model of portable computer was clearly saying, hey, we cannot really do that in-house very well. And look at Compaq, look at IBM, look at the other IBM clones, look at what they're doing. It seems to be working. All right. So, and that was not their, their key product, right? It's not the Apple II or the Mac or something like that. That was really carrying the company. So they say, okay, let's start to make it in factories that we do not own, and let's start to do it outside of the USA. That was really the start for the computers. And Apple was a computer company predominantly, right, at the time. Okay. Another interesting early case was the laser printer. So laser printers on the US market were selling for a high price. They heard that Canon had some interesting designs and it was much cheaper. So Canon in Japan, and Apple worked with Canon to design and manufacture a relatively low cost laser printer. And it was a big hit. It was sold about $7,000 plus $3,000 for the Mac. So $10,000. There was like a whole package, and overall it was much cheaper. And that's how Apple really got a strong foothold with publishers and people who design brochures and catalogs and things like that. And that really also kind of saved the Mac, which at that point was sort of a commercial failure. All right. So it became quite profitable. And some people actually say that, hey, in the mid 1980s, at that point, actually, Apple was making more money from printers than computers, and was moving a lot of printers. He was arguably more of a printer company than a computer company. That was interesting. But okay. A very important model made in Japan with very high success. That obviously is something that they remember. They kept going with Japan. So at the time, Japan was obviously much cheaper than it is now, and it seemed to be the place to go for outsourcing the manufacturing of electronic products. Then people, you might remember that Apple launched a PDA, a portable digital assistant called the Newton. And one of the first things that Steve Jobs did when he came back was just stop it, because it was a bit of an embarrassment. It was really not really good. And that was made in Japan by Sharp. And Apple also learned quite a bit here. Apple actually got burned because Sharp used what it learned working on PDAs for Apple, and they launched their own PDA. So, okay, interesting. The contract manufacturer wants to become a original design manufacturer and do their own thing and come and compete with us in the marketplace. Ouch. And by the way, Apple was not the only one having this issue. When before mainland China became a really, really central place in electronic contract manufacturing, Taiwan in the late 1990s and very early 2000s was really the main place to go. And the computer brands like Dell, HP, and so on worked with some Taiwanese manufacturers like Acer, Pegasus, and so on. And some of them actually launched their own brand, like Asus. And Acer, now they are competing directly against Dell, HP, and so on. And so they learned from the Dells of the world, and then they started to compete with them. So this is obviously, that's the ODM sort of model, where the manufacturer learns and then starts to hire their own designers, do a lot of the R&D themselves, and then they kind of move up the chain, and then they even become a B2C brand. They sell directly to the final users. Okay, so Apple kind of got burned here. Obviously helped them understand the benefits, but also the risks of outsourcing manufacturing. All right. And that was at the time when Apple was kind of crumbling under its own debt. They had to sell one of their manufacturing facilities to a contract manufacturer called SCI in the USA to just to get some cash, just to be able to pay salaries. I mean, this was a pretty dire situation. All right. And SCI, interesting. There's an interesting little story here. They were the first major EMS, electronic manufacturing services company. Okay. They were involved in some of the electronics manufacturing for the space program decades earlier, and they themselves made major advances, contributed major advances to the SMT process for PCB assembly and things like that. Okay. And they were making PCs for IBM actually at the time. Okay, so now in the 1990s, Japan got too expensive. Their currency was way too strong. They just lost competitiveness. So Apple, just like their computers, started to look at Taiwan, okay, and as well as South Korea, okay, and probably a bit in Malaysia and so on. Japanese manufacturers had been relocating some production to Taiwan also, and South Korea, and kind of teaching them, hey, here's how to do electronic manufacturing. So there was already something, there was already a basis from there. And the direct competitors of Apple were taking advantage of that lower labor cost and so on. So obviously Apple had to kind of follow. But at that time, the main product line, the Mac computer, was still made in Apple's own factories. And then that changed when Steve Jobs came back and said, okay, we're just going to have like 4 lines, 2 for business customers, 2 for consumers, and one is going to be fixed workstation, one's going to be a laptop, basically, something portable. And they started to work on a great and very differentiated new product that turned out to be the iMac. Okay, and the industrial design studio with Johnny Ive came up with a concept. And there's an entire story about that. And basically it really shows that at that time, they were pretty weak in design for manufacturing. It's like the designers were putting out some kind of concept and saying, I kind of don't care about the limitations of manufacturing, just find a way. Okay. Without trying to understand. Okay. So they came up with that kind of concept, and then the engineers came up with dozens of reasons why it was so difficult, and in the end, like, it just couldn't be done. But there was enormous pressure from Steve Jobs. He really wanted to do a product that moved the needle, that would be sort of a base roadmap for the future products. He wanted something that could save the company. Okay, it was like a signal to the world, right? So they pushed a lot. Then they had to go out to some very experienced mechanical designers who looked at it and say, "Nah, there's really no way." So finally, okay, they went back, and finally the industrial design studio took into account the feedback they got, reworked it, came up with a new concept that this time was manufacturable. However, they needed a manufacturing partner that had very high skills in making the tooling for the enclosure specifically. So they worked with LG in South Korea because they also needed LG to make the monitor. Okay, so make the monitor, you make the enclosure, why not? You just assembled everything. All right, so that's the way it went. And the Apple engineers were flying over and looking at all the details of the designs in the industrialization phase. And tooling got made well, and the product got released. It was successful commercially. That's great. And then, gradually, so in the late 1990s, Apple really resorted to just completely outsourcing the manufacturing, including its main product lines, the computers. And there was a very strong mandate from Steve Jobs that went all the way down, like, we want zero defect, we just want excellence. If you're not an A player, like, you don't belong here. And if you're not ready to work weekends and nights and so on, and to do your job, like, get out of here. Is going to be extremely high expectations. And that resulted in extremely high pressure also on the contract manufacturers. The good thing is that they had to figure things out as they went. When the industrial design studios say, no, we want this, and it's really important, then we'll push engineers to try new things, and they came up with new production methods and so on. So a lot of good, interesting new things came out of this. And Apple, more and more, since their strategy was really to lead in bringing differentiated, better and very differentiated product to the marketplace. That was their strategy. So they kept pushing for a lot of customized parts, a lot of things to be sort of reinvented, right? So they pushed their contract manufacturers to innovate on the process and really to learn a lot. All right. So that's one of the points of the book. Right? Why am I sort of belaboring this point here? Is that they really upskilled their contract manufacturers. They worked with the contract manufacturers that showed they were hungry, that showed they would send a lot of engineering resources on the Apple projects, right? They wanted to be the really tough customer that manufacturers want to work with, because their teams will learn so much. And because it's a signal to the world that, hey, these guys, they work with Apple over the years and they've learned a lot, and like they're really capable of doing the best. So that's really an important point in the book. And so back to South Korea and LG. LG set up some manufacturing sites in the UK and in Mexico, and it did not go well overall. LG was a bit cocky, negotiating with Apple, like, hey, you can't really kick us out of here. Like, don't push us around too much. LG actually had a very strong role in DFM and industrialization of the product. They had all the files, the documentation, etc. And one LG executive actually said that LG had designed the iMac, and that obviously infuriated some people in Cupertino at Apple. In addition, there were design issues. Some of the wrong components were picked. It even resulted in some computers catching fire and so on. And there was a lot of, arguments, right, between Apple and LG about, hey, who's responsible for that? And I think Apple probably learned a lot from that. Don't let the contract manufacturer really drive the process. We should be able to know all this, and we should make sure the process, the design and so on doesn't lead to these issues, but also the contract manufacturer doesn't feel they are in a position of strength, right? And that's really something that informed their moves after that. In the meantime, they had started to work with Honhai, also known as Foxconn, in Taiwan, and Foxconn basically brought them to China, to Shenzhen. Okay. And Apple started to really embed dozens of engineers in the contract manufacturer during the final phases of the design, the industrialization, the manufacturing. They would be all over it to supervise, to control what happens. So that it really shows like they built this muscle. Okay, we need to have the engineers with the experience to get that done, right? So there's industrial design comes up with, this is the concept, this is what, like the look and feel and so on. And then it comes down to several groups of engineers that work closer and closer with manufacturing. And over time, Apple has hired thousands and thousands of people. I think I read that in another book maybe last year, also about Apple, also well documented, said that Apple had something like 10,000 people working for them in China. So they are following things very, very carefully. Now, the author talked to a lot of ex-employees of Apple, and something that really comes out is the level of intensity was amazing. The amount of pressure from Steve Jobs and all the way down the chain and into the contract manufacturers. And obviously, some of the manufacturers will do well in this type of situation, and others will not do very well. Okay. And how come Apple gave so much business to Foxconn, right? So basically, they started to buy connectors from Foxconn, and then Terry Go, the founder of Foxconn, just kept going for more business. And then when he heard of all the issues with LG, he already had a relationship with Tim Cook, the current CEO of Apple, who used to work at Compaq, another computer manufacturer, before joining Apple. And Compaq was making a lot of computers at Foxconn. So he basically called Tim Cook and said, okay, yeah, I heard about all your issues with LG making the iMac. I can fix this mess. Allow me to be a second source, and I can do it. And I can reverse engineer a lot of the things. Let me show you. Right? So that's really how they get their foot in the door for the computers. And then later, the iPods, the iPhone, and so on. There is also that moment around 2000 where suddenly manufacturing in China became, got from, are you sure? Like they really know nothing about electronics. They have no experience. The culture is no good. Like you cannot make high quality products, etc., etc. All the way to, actually, that's the place to do it. Right? So how did that happen? Before 2000, already the tariffs were lowered and so on and so forth. But then really when China became part of the World Trade Organization in 2000, that led to a change, is that a lot of companies started to say, okay, now we can actually invest in China and it's not very risky. Right? And that's where some of the assembly was in China, and then there was more and more pressure to bring a lot of the component manufacturers, and a lot of Taiwanese manufacturers were really instrumental in that. Oh, okay, you really push me. Okay, I start a factory making the parts in mainland China. All right. The Malaysians, also Koreans to an extent, and so on. Obviously, it's not just Taiwan, but there's a big focus on Taiwan here in the electronics industry. So a lot of the parts moved to China. Assembly, cheaper because the labor is much, much cheaper. Well, at that time, it was much cheaper than places like Taiwan or Korea. All right. And then once one contract manufacturer was there, then the brands, the Apple, Compaq, and so on, say, hey, the others, like, we need the China price. Like, what are you doing? How come you're not in China? So Quanta in Taiwan set up a big campus in Shanghai, whatever, Pegatrop, and so on and so forth, right? And obviously Foxconn in Shenzhen is the one that drove this the fastest and really grew the operations to an enormous extent. Terry Go, again, the founder of Foxconn, was really good at getting subsidies, getting help, getting a lot of support from the local government, a lot of free land, machinery and construction financed, at least in part, by the government. He really benefited from that. And then what he did is he delivered on the amount of business that he promised. Right? So that was a quid pro quo, and he played that very, very well. The Chinese government, as I mentioned, subsidized pretty much everything they could, because they really needed, every local government really needed an industrial base, because they were getting a part of the value-added tax, right? So they really needed to attract foreign investment. And for a company like Apple, they figured, oh, wait a minute, here, things are very, very different. Like, there's no labor shortage, no problem. People were queuing up at the gates of the factories at that time. Speed is amazing. Everything moves much faster. How come Foxconn, they tell us they can make the tooling in 5 weeks, but usually it's like 12 weeks. Like, what's going on in this place, right? That also came from Foxconn's general approach of, it's like the army, and we're all in this together. Let's go. Let's move as fast as we can, and let's put enormous pressure on the teams and so on. Okay, but there was really a China element. And also, for a company like Apple, they noticed, hey, we can embed the engineers, and we can use our commercial position to get the manufacturers to sign the contracts that we want, pretty much, because we move millions of units, and we can basically be in control of everything. Okay. So whereas, Foxconn and a lot of others had a strategy of sort of hooking the customers, like, oh, okay, now you work with us, and then we make these plastic parts, and we make these metal parts, and we do PCB assembly, and we do this, and we do that, and we do that. You can't really go away from us, and then we're going to extract more profit. We're going to buy the parts cheaper, but still invoice you like we bought it for a higher price, and so on and so forth. And they were doing that for a lot of their customers, including, cheating even on the specifications of the components, and so on and so forth. But Apple team was and is extremely tough, and basically stayed in control, right? So as the author notes, Apple's business given to Foxconn led to much higher sales of Foxconn, but actually the profit margin went down a lot. They kind of squeezed Foxconn like crazy. And Foxconn was apparently still happy for, being the bigger contract manufacturer, basically, and very interested in very high volume. So they went with it. I'm not sure they were very happy, but they kept going for it, basically. Another thing that Apple found about China is that on a big campus or basically a factory city like Foxconn in Longhua in Shenzhen, they could go there and they say, okay, the assembly is here. Okay, hey, let's see the tooling fabrication, and where's the plastic going to be made? Oh, it's just here. Okay. And what about SMT? Oh, it's just going to be there. And what about where are the connectors made? Where is this made? Where is this made? What about the display and so on? And a lot of the components were close to assembly. And if you needed to go to some other specialized manufacturers, also it was basically all in Shenzhen, within Shenzhen and Dongguan. So within 1 hour around the factory, you would get anything. And suppliers were extremely responsive because, hey, it goes to, usually what I hear is, oh, this is the supply chain of the, how does it say? The fruit company. They don't say Pingo. They don't say Apple. They say Shuiguo. Yeah, the fruit company, right? It's very big. It's kind of prestigious to work with them. It means you're sort of, the best in the industry, the best at what you do. So suppliers of parts, suppliers of surface treatment and so on were very, very responsive. And so, yeah, basically, I could keep going on and on, but I think it's probably better if you find this interesting, grab the book. There's a lot of information in there. It's not a small book. And really, the author did an awesome job documenting all this. And again, the point that he's driving is, how what he says is this is the Chinification of the electronics industry, right? And they show that Apple, through its intense focus on raising the bar, on innovating on manufacturing processes, on being really stringent on quality standards, and so on and so forth, really taught not just Taiwan, not just China, but also, in part, they taught to some of the contract manufacturers in Taiwan how to be better at their job. Maybe some of the same in some other countries. The author doesn't go much into that, but really the way they did that in China was just mind-blowing, right? And then they put some figures. They say that Apple invested so much money in actually training the engineers, the managers, the workforce, etc. in China, that they really set the stage for the behemoth, the force that Apple is now in the electronics industry. And that's why it became so central, and now it is so hard to replace for companies that want to move their supply chain away from China. All right, so that's a pretty interesting book in that regard. I really recommend it. Okay, yeah, that's it for today's podcast. Thanks for listening. Send us a note from time to time. We're always happy to hear from listeners. Thank you.
Thanks again for listening to this podcast, brought to you by the Sofeast Group. We're on a mission to provide you with everything you need to manufacture effectively in Asia, including inspections, auditing, new product development support, contract manufacturing, 3PL warehousing and fulfillment, and much, much more across Asia's key manufacturing areas. Visit us at sofeast.com, that's SOFEAST.com, to learn more and get help. If you've enjoyed the podcast today, please do rate, review and share, because it will really help others discover us too.